G'day, my name is Patrick McGrath and I'm the Strategy Manager at OneModel, the world's leading people analytics platform. Welcome to the first of what we hope will be a series of short webinars about the practical applications of people analytics for large organisations. Today we will look at the data and engagement required to deliver inclusion programs to your colleagues living with a disability. Today's guest is a longtime friend of mine, Rex Betar. Rex is a disability advocate and strategy consultant. Welcome, Rex.
Thanks, Pat.
Rex, for the benefit of those watching, I wanted to quickly go through your background. You were born 10 weeks premature and diagnosed with cerebral palsy. At the age of 12, defying doctors' expectations, you taught yourself how to walk. At 18, you became the first member of your family to graduate high school. You then went to the University of New South Wales, where you graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws. You then completed your Masters of Laws jointly at the National University of Ireland in Galway and the Queen's University in Belfast. And to top things off, you completed your MBA at the University of Oxford. In your working career, you've worked in strategy roles at Qantas, Channel 10 and Westpac, as well as a management consultant at Nous Group and McKinsey & Company. You're a board member of Physical Disability Council of New South Wales. Now, did I miss anything in that rundown, Rex?
Happily married, father of two, but otherwise, I think you got it all.
Perfect. Well, look, can I also just say, look, as someone who's been your friend and kind of watched your success with great pride over the last 20 years, it's a privilege to know you and thank you for spending some time with me today.
Well, thanks, Pat.
And mate, just also, now that I've given you a massive wrap, you better be bloody insightful for the next 20 minutes, or I think the people watching will be bitterly disappointed.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, perfect. Look, just as a way to start, when organisations or even individuals are looking at how they can make their workplaces more inclusive for people living with a disability, what's the first piece of advice that you always give to them?
I mean, the first kind of question is, and usually the answer to this is yes, if they're asking that question. But do you actually have people with disability working for you, right? Because a lot of places don't, and or maybe they've got one employee that's a person with disability, or at least one that they know of, and they're like, why don't we have more? It's like, well, are you making it a priority in recruiting? Are you sort of consciously thinking about how your workplace is perceived by people with disability? Are you reaching out to people with disability? And that doesn't necessarily have to be kind of formal programs, although sometimes it is, and those are particularly useful. But sadly, for people with disability, like a lot of employers, whether by design or by accident, kind of are still off limits for people with disability, and they don't actually have people with disability working for them. So my first question is like, well, what are you doing to get people with disability in the door?
Yeah. And is there, when you look at that, is there a model of best practice that you look to?
There, not really. I mean, there are organizations in the disability field that are pretty good at this. Higher Up is one of those. But you would kind of expect organizations that work in the field to be sort of pretty good at that. In terms of government agencies, the NDIA that administers the NDIS is obviously pretty good as well. But actually, it's disability particularly is pretty poor across the board. Like if you look at organizations with a reputation for diversity and their diversity councils, they will have portfolios, and likely they will have a gender or a women's portfolio. They might have an LGBTQI portfolio, and they may have an Indigenous portfolio. I'm yet to see a large organization that even has disability as one of the portfolios.
And so OneModel is a people analytics business. So data is at the heart of what we do. What are the key data elements that organizations should be collecting about their workforce when it comes to disability?
Well, uh, you can't really make a workplace inclusive if you don't know who in your workplace is a person with disability, right? So I think it's probably true of any kind of data, but knowing is the first step, and just getting some kind of fact set to begin with. So um, you know, um, how many people in your workplace have disability? Um, how does their disability affect them? And some of this stuff is sort of opt-in at recruitment phase, and a lot of folks have this on standard recruitment, which is, do you have a disability? Do you require any kind of reasonable adjustments? So they'll have that kind of data, and that's a useful starting point. But how much do you really know, both at an organizational level of what a person's disability or disabilities might be and how they affect them, and then how much do their sort of direct manager or direct managers know, and the people that sort of control their sort of immediate workspace. Like, do you know if I have additional needs because of my disability that might just be a different desk or a chair, but might go well beyond that as well.
And one of the things that you and I were talking about before is how that type of data can interact with other pieces of data that people may know about their employees. So how far does someone live away from work? What kind of role do they have at that organization? Those types of things. How would you look at, if you were designing these types of programs, how would you look at other pieces of data that may help enable those inclusion programs for people living with a disability?
Yeah, so I think you've got to, and this is the management consultant in this. So if anybody and everybody that watches this, forgive me, but there's a little bit of what's the problem you're trying to solve. So are you trying to make, if it's trying to make the workplace as inclusive as possible, and as easy as possible for someone with disability to do their job, then the answer to your question is kind of myriad, right? Because it's going to be slightly different for each individual depending on their disability and their needs. But some things that I want people to know about me, and I found that are really useful, which, by the way, have never been in a kind of formal information gathering way, so much as I'll be chatting to sort of someone in charge or someone available, someone in a position to be able to kind of help, that then makes my kind of work life much easier. And the best that you mentioned travel, the best example I have of this is over dinner one night, at one of my previous employers, they were sort of asking, how do I get to work every day? And I said, I get taxis every day, and this is when I was in consulting, and I said, and if I'm at the client pays for that, because obviously that's away from my usual place of work. If I'm going to the office, then I just pay. And I'm like, well, why doesn't the company pay? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a very good question. It's like, okay, you need to go speak to this person tomorrow and tell them that, like, you're getting taxis to work every day, right?
Yep.
And which not even early on in your career, when you're kind of mid-career, if you're spending $40 each way each day, like, and maybe 3 days a week, you're dropping $240 on taxis a week. That's a lot of money for anybody. And so to have sort of that help, and someone like, we'll take this off your mind. This is something you don't have to worry about. So I think that's very specific to me. But what I would say is, particularly people with physical disability, transport is always a big one. And how do you get to and from your place of work? I think that sort of and I don't want to get on my high horse now, but it's hard not to, because I'm passionate about this topic. I think that goes to access, which can happen in a lot of places, right? So then which is a bit physical space. So there's a couple of elements to this. One is sort of the obvious stuff, which is even less obvious to people sometimes, which is is the workplace an accessible workplace? So, is it one of these old buildings where there is kind of steps up to the street to get there in the first place? Because if so, that's a challenge. Is there, are the doors wide enough that a wheelchair user can come in and use the office? Do you have like an accessible toilet in the office? Things like this, which I've worked at workplaces in the last dozen years where the answer to that is no. Or or worse, they think they've got an accessible toilet, but actually you need to go and ask sort of the receptionist for the key to the accessible toilet, right? So there's things like that, which usually workplaces do a pretty good job. Where it gets challenging is whenever there is something that is out of the day-to-day, right? So if you've got a client off-site or even a company off-site, is the person organizing that off-site thinking about accessible spaces? Do they even know whether there are people with disability going to be at the off-site in the first place? And for what it's worth, my advice would be, whether you know or not, design like it needs to be accessible, right? But if you're designing, even if it's a conference, if you're designing for, there's going to be wheelchair users there, then you need to have spaces where there are no seats so the wheelchairs can be parked, right? You need someone to also point to where the accessible toilets are, not just the toilets when they're introducing the day. Then it goes into a bunch of detail which you kind of don't know unless you've been trained into this. That it's actually really hard for a lot of people with disability to regulate their own body temperature. So is the aircon blasting in the room? So one of the things I'll always do is, whenever I'm hosting an event where I know people with disability will be there, I'll be like, guys, this room way too cold for people with disability. They'll be, it's a little cold for us, and someone will say, the guys can wear their jackets, which is already ignoring, the half the people in the room that aren't guys, but also totally makes the room inaccessible for people with disability, and is not something you'd particularly think about. So there's a lot of, once you kind of get in, there's a lot of different areas, but access to space is a big one, right? Because if you, whilst able-bodied people might not notice, if you're a person with disability and you're walking into a space that there's either got steps without a railing, or there's no clear accessible toilet, or is too cold for you, that's a pretty big red flag that I'm not welcome here, or once again, no one thought to check with me what my needs might be.
As on to the aspect of kind of having that that trust or feeling kind of welcome in those circumstances. Obviously knowing what metrics to collect, about your workforce is one step, but collecting that data and ensuring it's accurate is another. And we often talk to HR leaders who tell us that when they're engaging with their employees who are living with a disability, that those employees won't necessarily disclose to their employer that information. And when they engage those employees, they say, well, we don't trust that sharing that information will lead to actual change within their organization. So what's the point? What can organizations do to show that they are genuinely committed to that type of inclusion and build a culture of trust where people are willing to share that information that then allows that better planning, and those better solutions to be implemented?
Yeah, that's not an easy question, because you're fighting against quite a bit of history when you try and do that. And so I think the first step, I think there's a couple of elements which can help. And I think the first one is understanding why people are reluctant, right? And at least part of the reason is because almost everybody with disability would have experienced, if not in an employment situation, but usually in an employment situation, in going for jobs, some kind of situation where they were looking good for the job, and then the person on the other side of it found out they had disability, and all of a sudden, the job was filled, or they became reluctant, right? So there is a lot of firsthand experience, and I've had that firsthand experience, not for a long time, thankfully, but I've definitely had it where the moment you disclose, you're getting sort of adverse findings against you.
Yeah.
So I think
Apart from being amoral is also illegal. As well.
So I think understanding where it's coming from is one part, and then I think sort of the second part is understanding the building blocks that sort of need to be in place before you go and collect the data. So if you understand the history, then you will probably realize that, leading with, hey, we're now collecting sort of what in some cases is very intimate data on people's disability, won't be really well received by your employees with disability. So building those building blocks of trust. And so then is, well, what do those building blocks look like? And I think in the short term, you have to have some sort of carrot. So you can't, and it actually has to be like a really specific carrot. So we want to get everybody, everybody with disability, an additional $500 to kind of sort out their home office or something, right? But it needs to be a specific carrot because you're A, you're fighting against that history, and B, like you're asking for really personal details. So, I need a specific and sort of near term, if not contemporaneous, kind of carrot for giving over that information. It doesn't always have to be monetary, but it has to be something more than a general, we will use this information to build a more inclusive workforce, right? And then I'd kind of ask, well, what are the other, sort of back to the original point, what are the other things we're doing in the disability space? Because it'll look a little bit weird if data collection was the first step. So, are we at least if not before, are we in parallel creating a disability action plan for our workplace? Are we, creating a disability employment program for the first time? Are we, what are the other things we're doing in this space? Because I think it would be a stretch to start with data collection as the first step.
Yep. No, that's wonderful feedback and really useful. Last question. There's been a great deal of coverage about the move of organisations to flexible work arrangements, and one of the challenges that I've had with this reporting has been its narrowness. It's generally only talks about some of the most kind of flexible and innovative companies on earth with comparatively small and role homogenous workforces and how they're embracing flexible modes of work post-pandemic. But not much detail has been given to how this change will affect some of the most vulnerable members of the workforce, and that's people living with a disability, or for that matter, organisations where flexible modes of work are harder to implement, customer service roles in government, and so forth. What in your view are the things that organisations need to do to make sure that this move to more flexible working engagements doesn't discriminate against people living with a disability?
So, I think you're right, Pat. Sadly, I think, on the whole, it is almost inevitable that this shift in arrangements will discriminate against people with disability. In the same way, it's going to put more pressure on any kind of minorities. And we've seen that with parents with young children, right? And I think any parent homeschooling children at the moment can tell you, how difficult the current environment is. I don't think there's any easy answers. I think, like I said before, there is, again with the general point, and specifically here, there is something about getting it on the agenda and getting it quick and understanding the basics of the issue. So one is, if you don't already have someone working on the specifics of, people with disability as part of your, remote work, hybrid work transition plan, which I assume every business is well on the way to developing and implementing. If not, they should be at this point. So is there someone that is responsible for disability and making sure any existing and future workers with disability are kind of thought for in a careful and considered way? I think that's number one. I think number two is like that person and others getting a kind of a basic understanding of the issues, right? And here is there is the general sort of disability issues, which we touched on before, which will vary by person to person. There's also some really specific pandemic related issues that are going to be true in a lot of cases, which is people with disability have incredibly low vaccination rates versus the sort of sorry about it. I'll just
No, I've got you back. Yeah.
So people with disability have incredibly low vaccination rates versus the general population.
Yep.
So if you're looking at a hybrid return to work, well, there is, have your workers with disability have the chance or opportunity to be vaccinated. Second, people with disability are going to be sort of more likely to potentially not be able to be vaxxed due to sort of immunocompromisation or other reasons. And then thirdly, and somewhat worryingly, it is unclear how serious COVID will be for people with disability that are double vaccinated. So if you're double vaccinated but still get it, yes, it will be much more mild, but how serious will that be for people with disability? And part of that question will vary by individual, right? So getting an understanding of those issues and saying that actually, like, even when we're, 85%, 90%, pick a number, double dosed, you may have some reluctance of people with disability coming into the office. That there is an additional, I guess, set of COVID specific concerns. Then I think there is sort of the more nuanced, which will vary by individual and by workplace, which I think, as we kind of touched on before, you don't want to start with just a data collection exercise, but actually this situation also presents you with an opportunity, which is you can start with hey, we're trying to make hybrid or remote work as comfortable as possible for everyone, and we're making people with disability a particular focus of that. Therefore, we would like to collect data on the following, right? And we would like, you to tell us in all specifics, what are your, how can we help in terms of an in the office environment? How can we help, in a home office environment? Are you comfortable coming into the office if everyone's double vaxxed? Things like that. And I think one of working in sort of, or volunteering in disability advocacy, you always want to leave it up to the individual to decide. You want to make sure they've got all options and you're offering them options, and that they're real options and it doesn't feel like lip service. But you also don't want to just sort of, okay, we're just going to mandate that people with disability will work from home, right? So this hybrid working model is an opportunity to get to know your workforce better. But I guess likewise, there is a risk that in a well-intentioned risk minimization strategy, their workforce accidentally does something that negatively affects people with disabilities. So there's some of the things I would think about kind of initially, but it is a tough question. And the big one is, do you have, as with disability generally, do you have someone whose job it is to think about these questions?
Yeah. Perfect. Well, Rex, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And I always find talking to you about these things incredibly insightful. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. For those watching, also thank you. But please let me know your feedback on the format of this webinar, topics you would like covered in the future, and suggestions for future guests we should interview. And Rex, thanks again, mate. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Pat.
Cheers.